Families, and we are here for Be Strong Families webinar series, Staying Strong and Positive for Ourselves and Our Children. And as you come in the room, if you would say hello by going to the chat and clicking the second item that there says panelists and attendees, and saying who you are and where you're joining from. I am going to just close my door because I have banging going on in the house. Yes, Be Strong Families, we're still at our houses. We're still a virtual organization. Everybody likes working from home, or most people do. Hi, Tammy. Hi, Lawan. Nice to see you both. Pennsylvania and DC. It's beautiful weather and people are getting back to work. We're having smaller groups. But great conversations, right? I mean, those of you who were here yesterday, I mean, Lawan was here yesterday, Tammy was, I know, and great conversations. Yeah, thanks, Tammy. Okay, well, let's get started, Paul. Let's move to the next slide. Today, our conversation is on mental emotional vitality. You know, we're doing our grief, trauma, and loss month in June. And today, the focus is on mental and emotional vitality. And we talk about gallows humor, guilty pleasures, and other distractions. So as part of a grieving process. So let's go to the next slide. I'm going to need you to talk, especially if we stay as small as we are. It's going to be almost like a table conversation, which is fabulous. At cafes, we can get really deep. If you aren't, let's see, when you're ready to comment, raise your hand. Hi, Anna, and we'll unmute you, and then you'll need to unmute yourself. And you can always use the chat. The chat is our primary way to engage. And just in recognition that we co-create this safe space together, if you would, next slide, Paul, if you would take note of our agreements, and if you can agree to these agreements, just type in I agree. And without further ado, awesome. So all of our questions today come from our booster pack for Vitality Cafes that's on Grief Compass, Navigating Trauma and Loss. So our first question is, drum roll please, Paul, please move to the next slide. So there's two questions. What is your experience of TV shows and movies as part of grieving? And how can you release guilt around guilty pleasures? Let's start with the first one. What is your experience of TV shows and movies as part of your grieving process? Who has experience with TV shows and movies? I know when grief is really intense for me, I have no ability to focus on anything. And sometimes it can be a great distraction to just get caught up in something mindless. And I know when I'm not talking about like the death thing so much as like, you know, during COVID, when the grieving process in COVID, I was doing a lot of watching of guys' grocery games. I didn't want to be watching like Law and Order or anything deep or anything sad or anything scary. I just wanted to watch guys' grocery games. And I binge watched guys' grocery games. Let's see. Anna says you can relate, and that's when you really start to cry. And Tammy says, I'm not sure I've ever thought about that one. I think for me, it's nice to have a distraction or maybe something funny. Dana says, Steel Magnolias always makes me cry. Yeah. So some people are watching things explicitly that, you know, do trigger the grief and trigger the sadness and the emotion. And then some of us, it's like more of getting away from the grief and getting lost in somebody else's. Genevieve said, I myself am not able to watch TV or listen to music. I just like to be alone. When you're grieving, Genevieve, is that what you're saying? When you're in a grieving process, you don't want to watch TV or listen to music. You just want to be alone. Mm-hmm. Anna says, I like the Beauty and the Beast. You want to end up being happy. Yeah. So we all do different things with TV and movies, but they are can be part of the grieving process. So here's another question. How can you release guilt around guilty pleasures? Has anybody ever felt guilty for having fun or enjoying oneself or taking care of oneself when you're in the middle of navigating trauma and loss or grieving? Ever felt guilty about doing something for yourself? This isn't a good one for me to talk through because my spirituality is all tied up in acts of love and pleasure, being rituals, and needing to take care of myself, knowing that I need to take care of myself, not just knowing in my head, but really knowing in my whole body and my heart that if I'm not taking care of myself, if I'm not sleeping, if I'm not having some kind of fun, if I'm not relaxing in some ways, that everything breaks down. Paul says always, so I try to include others if I can. Paul, you always feel guilty for guilty pleasures, and so others make it feel less guilty.
I do, because sometimes I used to enjoy. Sometimes I have a hard time watching something that I used to enjoy with other people who aren't in my life anymore. So I avoid that stuff. But there's definitely stuff that I used to enjoy that's like, this would be more fun. I should be doing other things. I should be resolving other things, and I can't right now. And I really shouldn't be distracting myself. So there are people that I know who share these interests, and I can relate to them instantaneously and share that with them. And that way it lessens the anxiety of other issues.
Nice. Thank you for sharing that and helping me with keeping the conversation going. I appreciate it. Dana says, sometimes it's a complete immersion. I want to be swallowed up by my grief, allowed to feel my feelings completely expressively. Other times I like to escape from the realities of my reality into someone else's world. And Tammy says, I have felt guilty not following others' expectations around rituals. And Luan says, listening to music helps, and Tyler Perry shows. I enjoy personal care time. Personal care time helps, and prayer. And Anna says, I always like to think of the person and what they would like to be doing. I know they want me to be happy and not sad. Dana says, as a caretaker, I tend to always be on. And when there's a family crisis, I tend to shut myself down and support the family, knowing I will deal with my own feelings later on. I can compartmentalize well under pressure. Yeah, I relate to that one too, Dana. Dana, nobody can see what you're saying because you have it to panelists only, and you're saying such great things. So please, yeah, thanks. So I'll read what Dana said again, because she says, sometimes it's a complete immersion. I want to be swallowed up by my grief, allowed to feel my feelings completely, expressively. Other times I like to escape from the realities of my reality into someone else's world. And as a caretaker, I tend to always be on. And when there's a family crisis, I tend to shut myself down and support the family, knowing I will deal with my own feelings later on. I can compartmentalize well under pressure. Yeah, I know you like to read along, Tammy. And that I think is also, sounds very mature, Dana. I mean, it sounds very mature that like, it's, and when we're talking about mental and emotional vitality, it's kind of like, you can compartmentalize. I can compartmentalize well under pressure as well. I'm just don't know where the line is, in terms of, do you ever, I guess that's a question, is where's that line between taking care of others and compartmentalizing under pressure and really falling down that slippery slope of not taking care of yourself in the context. I don't know. I mean, I have lots of friends also. Like, this is something I worry about with my friends. Maybe I shouldn't worry about it, but I worry about it because I see them, like, when there's a lot of stress, like when they're taking care of other people and other things, or their job or whatever, and I see them like going full bore and on that stuff. And when I say, like, be sure, like, can I bring you dinner, or can we go do something, or just trying to take the pressure. No, I'm in the zone. I just have to keep doing what I'm doing. But then they start getting sick too. Then their bodies start saying, like, you have to and sometimes they don't pay attention even to that, So I guess, I don't know, like, how do we stop ourselves from running ourselves into the ground, or, can't be my friends there. Oh, Dana, good.
I think part of it is that I've always been the caretaker, and I've always been the person that wants everybody to have a, if not happy existence around me, at least a neutral existence around me. And so that's always been my personality. And when I say that I tend to be on during a family crisis, it's not to the extent that I don't relieve the stress myself, or I don't take care of myself in the process, but I have a really great ability. It's kind of like my superpower, I guess, is that when there is a family crisis, I am very able to remove myself from that event and situation happening, and I can identify the needs of other people in the situation. And my family's been through a fair amount of, like, some extreme traumas. For one instance, my cousin was murdered in front of her 18-month-old son by his father.
Oh my goodness.
It was a horrendous event. And my uncle was absolutely lost when he came back to my family's home for her burial. She was in California at the time. And unfortunately, because of some really poor mortuary work on that end, when she came back to our hometown, she was nearly unrecognizable. And so it was very easy for me to identify how I could help the people around me, and know that I would be working through that in my own way after the fact. And so I was able to be just a rock for him that entire time. My mom and dad had each other. Everybody else kind of had their spouses or their kids or somebody to lean on. And he was coming from the West Coast, and he was by himself. His wife wasn't able to make it. And so I just completely supported him, and I made myself available to him. And I said, look, I know how devastated you are. I will drive you wherever you need to be, 2:00 in the morning. I don't care. I stayed with him at the funeral home before the visitation, hours afterwards, when he went out drinking with his friends. I stayed outside in the car, and I drove him home after. And I took good care of him. And in the process of doing that, I was able to really, in my mind, support the memory of who this person was to me. Because if they impacted my life enough, and this is like an immediate family member, so if they impacted my life enough, my care and concern for the people that love them and are mourning them is kind of how I show respect to them. Similar situation happened with my father-in-law. He was at home when he passed, and it was not a pretty end for him. It was very long and painful and nauseating to watch, quite honestly. And when he passed, and we knew he'd passed, I just ushered the entire family outside on the patio, because I knew that we'd have some calls and things to make. And my in-laws family is Greek. And so I brought them all out to the patio, and I brought out the bottle of ouzo, and I said, okay, everybody, we're going to have a drink to dad and we're going to celebrate what he was to us. And so I just kind of got that ball rolling while I went back inside the house, made a call to we had everything pretty much lined up before he passed because it was kind of a lengthy process. So I called the ambulance and I called the funeral home that was going to be working with him. And he wanted his body donated afterwards. And so made those calls, and everybody in the family just stayed outside, and they got so wrapped up in their memories of them. I heard them laughing and crying, and it was just so healing to me to kind of facilitate that for them, that I knew that that was my purpose in the moment.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Where I resonate with that is I've been a doula and a hospice worker, too. So like both ends of them. Now they have death doulas. I haven't gotten trained, and I didn't have training in being a doula for births either. But it was like that experience of totally immersing myself in what is going on in service of what's happening. With the usually it was with the woman and her husband, and just but after the fact, like, it's a kind of a service that people really love, and after the fact, like I could do it for like 24 hours or 48 hours or whatever, intensively and intentionally. But then they would want me to keep coming, like come to their house and keep giving that level of and I had to kind of like say, no, now it's time for me to go home, and now it's time for me to like get into my own life, because it was, I don't know, it was like that disorienting a little bit. Do you ever have that happen?
In the situations that I dealt with, because it was very specific to that, to each circumstance for those two instances, I knew it was a very short time. Like my uncle was only in town for 72 hours. So I knew that there was a finite amount of time that he would be there, and I could devote my entire time for that period of time to help him. With my father-in-law, like I said, his passing had been a long process. And so I was able to be with him for that. I have been the person that people call when they're at the hospital and they've given birth, like a stillbirth, and I will go and spend like the first 48 hours with them or something, just because I am able to provide that. But I haven't ever, in the instances where I have, I guess if you call it, provided that service or been a part of that piece, it has never been a situation where the person wasn't yet capable of letting go of the process. Like the instance with my cousin, even though it was a very sudden and horrific death, this, when her funeral was probably 3 months after she was actually killed. So he'd been processing his grief of the event already. It wasn't like, and both of the women that I went to their stillbirths, they knew ahead of time that they were going to be having a stillbirth. So it wasn't an immediate reaction to what they were just, that information they were just receiving. And I think that's part of the difference, because I could see easily becoming a crutch for that person, and I would have a hard time restricting myself from that.
Well, and after the 72 hours, I guess the question is, what did you do for you after that? Or did you not need to do anything? Was it just like return to your normal life?
After 72 hours, I had one more day that I was there with my family, and we hugged each other a lot and we cried a lot and we told stories about Jesse. And then when I went back home, my cousin that was murdered actually changed the trajectory of my life from that point forward. She's the reason that I became a foster parent. She's the reason that I adopted foster children. She's the reason that from that point forward, I worked with internet crimes against children. I worked with sexual assault victims. I worked with developmentally disabled people, because from that point forward, I was like, why couldn't she reach out to any of us? Why didn't she talk to any of us? Why did she feel like she had to hold on to that herself? Wow. And she is actually the reason that I actually was strong enough to end my marriage, living in the same kind of situation. And so I've taken a piece of her with me ever since then.
Wow. Dana, thank you so much for sharing all of that and being verbal and I know, I mean, I'm just extraordinarily grateful for your wisdom and for your story. You know, I think all of our, I was talking to one of my good friends yesterday who's a brilliant person who's working in San Francisco with childcare workers who are grieving a lot about COVID and their role and what has happened there. And she was just talking about like the why and how important the why is, and also the anti-racist work that she's been doing, and how people can get really burned out, and that the why revives it. And I feel like sharing your why, and that the why exists in stories for people, like it's your own why as to why you're doing what you're doing, why your life is the way it is, or all of ours is a story, you know. And that when we share those stories with each other, we kind of encourage and enliven each other, you know, and rekindle our own passion for what we're doing. So thank you so much, Dana. Yeah, I think the tragedy is that we lose our why along the way, unless we keep remembering, you know. I just want to note that Sylvia said earlier on, I recall being a little girl when my grandpa passed away, we were not allowed to watch TV or listen to music. Now I don't feel guilty if I don't follow some of the rituals that my family had. So releasing the guilt from not following expectations. We talked a lot about that one yesterday also. And I guess what Dana, in terms of the tragedy, losing our why along the way, what Lisa, my friend, was saying is that healing conversations are about exploring each other's whys or sharing our whys with each other. So that when we do that intentionally, it assists with just keeping it going. So speaking of which, let's go to the next slide, Paul. This is a little bit lighter. So how does humor help when you're experiencing loss? I mean, part of what we put up here, you know, in the title was about gallows humor. I don't know if anybody has gallows, anybody has experience with gallows humor, but that's like when it becomes absurd, like when you're like in the middle of middle of something like really deep, and you just start seeing the funny part of it or sharing the funny part with somebody else. And so how the humor can like lift you or bond you with the people that you're going through it with is like, just I can't believe this is happening, you know. And Paul says you might already be in a dark place, so the humor fits. Yeah, exactly. Dana says, I used to work with a morgue. I have a very dark humor. My coffee mug has a grave digger on it and says, any day above ground is a good day. You know? I think some people think I'm being inappropriate when I use humor in dark situations. Tammy says, right. I mean, it is like it can feel very inappropriate to outsiders from the conversation. Like sometimes when my family and I are like talking, like, you know, when we're in the middle of something, going through, like, I don't know, even getting rid of my father's things. Like my mom wanted to do it like really fast, and my sisters were there doing it with her. And I just remember some of the conversations like that we it's like, you know, just kind of saying, Mom, why is it so important that we do this? Like, you know, but not in a judgmental way, like in a kind of a laughing way, because it was hard, you know, it was hard. And it was hard to do the thing. And so kind of like stepping back from it and being a little bit lighter with it. And people are like, oh, I can't believe you said that. Like, it's like so inappropriate. But at the same time, that's sometimes what you need. Yeah, Tammy says, or something will strike me funny and I have to laugh, and this isn't the best time to be laughing, right? And Dana says, that's why we like each other so well. And Dana says, for me, laughter and tears come from the same place in me, my truth, my heart. Yep. So And we already talked about sometimes humor can be a distraction too, like when in different phases of the grief process. And I love that Judith gave us the word oscillation, but like when it's, I've talked about it feeling like the ocean, like it can smash you into the sand and then it recedes a little bit, and it gives you like a little break. And Judith Ehrman Shapiro, she did a great series for us a couple weeks ago on grieving. And your nervous system needs a reprieve. So sometimes in that time, like watching comedy and just getting lost in something can really help, give your nervous system a break. So others on humor when you're experiencing loss. Let's go to the next slide, Paul. We have a few minutes left. So when has distraction been helpful in your process, and how do you distract yourself? I guess this is again in recognition of this oscillation dynamic, which is that, you can't be in something truly intense in a prolonged way without it damaging, you. So sometimes distracting, or like we do with children, when children get upset and they sometimes you can distract them to something else, to look at something else, and it it just moves the energy. So how has distraction been helpful in your process, and how do you distract yourself? Paul, do you have an example of that? I'm gonna see if
it just reduces worry for me.
It reduces worry?
Yeah, because otherwise I'll just snowball into, something I can't get out of mentally about any situation or sadness.
Yeah, I mean, I think that whole distraction, like obsession, like I can like go way deep into it and it feels like it's not healthy. So I'm going to say even like this isn't normally thought of as distraction. It's probably like, but sometimes even prayer or even like meditation, like meditative practice or yoga can be a distraction for me. Like if my mind is going one way and I know that's not going to be like a healthy way for me to go, that it's just going to keep me stuck, that I will consciously tell my mind, no, we're not going to think about that. And reciting, like I remember in some really tough times, I'm Jewish, I would recite the Shema. Shema Yisrael, it's in the Bible, and I would say it in Hebrew, and I would just say it over and over again to like put my attention to God, this is when I was very, very observant at the time. But since then, like I do it, and it's easier to kind of shift my focus to God, or shift my focus to nature, shift my focus to out of the thing that's dragging me, and just like stop that energy and put myself towards, not something positive in the world, because I often don't have the energy for that, but to be like in a spiritual place, or in a spiritual, just stop and connect, I guess. So Tammy says distraction is very important to me in these situations when I can't think anymore. I like to crochet or watch mindless TV. Yep. And Dana says, I generally don't try to distract myself unless I start to feel guilt in the process. For me, when guilt enters the picture, it's no longer about the event, but it becomes a judgment. I use life as a distraction. I do something. That's the quickest way out for me. Journaling helps a lot. That's a beautiful way. I like to think about that. And Tammy said, sometimes the kids and grandkids are the best distraction. They can put a smile on my face anytime. Yep. And I was thinking pets too. Like that's another thing that is a distraction for me. Or like housework, like gardening. Like I recently, as you know, moved to this beautiful place and I started planting vegetables. And so just putting my hands in the dirt, it's very grounding. And it also like watering the plants, it's something that needs to be done. I'm feeling productive, but it's also a little bit meditative. or like being with, being with an animal. The dogs are great for this, but my cat is also pretty good, pretty cool. And Paul says sometimes the distraction re-energizes you. I'm feeling that. Wow. Well, we're almost at the end of our time here. So let's move to the next slide. And Dana says, I think nature, animals, and children remind us of the cycle of life on a deeper level. Yep. It's kind of like when I started doing hospice work, it was because I wanted to serve. And I mean, I was kind of like to myself, I was like, you're choosing to meet someone and go into the, at a time when you know that it's temporary. And I was like, yes, because that's what this is. That's what life is, So how can I invest totally in the relationship and in the moment and be completely present in it, but not attach, And Tammy says, I found relief in doing the dishes too. Sounds weird, but it's productive. Right. It doesn't sound weird at all to me, but it's way up there. It does take a lot of energy. Different sensory experiences with the sound and feel of the water are a good distraction. Great. And Tammy says, I really needed this conversation today. My stress level is way up there for several reasons right now. I need these reminders about self-care and not to feel guilty about it. Yeah, and ways of doing it that aren't necessarily intense, right, Tammy? Like doing the dishes or, like petting your animals or hanging out with your grandkids instead of like, and she said, if anyone's distraction, Dana says, is cleaning, I'll totally volunteer my house. That's a good note to end on. Tomorrow is our Grief Compass Cafe. And then Monday and Tuesday, we have guest presenters and hour-long webinars. So Yoli's going to be here on Monday with Grief as a Superpower, and then Spiritual Vitality in the Context of Grief, Trauma, and Loss. Ruby's going to be back on Tuesday. That's, as I said, he's got a really challenging presentation, but it's going to be fabulous. And then we started having this conversation on spiritual vitality and navigating trauma and loss. And we had like 9 questions in it. We only got to a few of them. And you all said you wanted to do it again. So we're going to continue that conversation next Wednesday. And also after Ruby's, it might be good to debrief a little bit. And then our last grief, trauma, and loss is on Thursday, and that's about post-pandemic. So thank you for being here. And as Paul, you can move it. This is the Grief Compass Navigating Trauma and Loss Cafe Booster Pack. The questions that we've had for these webinars all month are coming from this resource. Feel free to pick one up and have these conversations with your friends and relatives. Lots of love to everyone, and tomorrow's Friday, so I will see you next week. And I hope some of you will come to the Grief Compass Cafe. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you, Tammy. Perfect. Just really love this time with you all. Take care, everyone. Paul, you want to close us out?
Everyone, thanks so much. There's a poll that's launched, and I think that everyone's filled it out. So we're going to be closing up. Again, bestrongfamilies.org, and you can see links to upcoming events and our resources, including the Grief Compass.
Thank you, Paul. Bye-bye,
right.
Everybody.
Thanks, everybody. We're going to close it out for the next session.